A fitting send-off by the looks of it there in Melbourne today for Sisto Malaspina. And as mentioned, we'll come back to the latest terror arrests in Melbourne today in a moment. To the migration debate, though, now, and a shift from the Prime Minister in a speech he gave last night. Earlier in the year, Scott Morrison was pushing back at pressure from within the government to cut the permanent migration intake, the annual migration intake. Yes, it has come down, but not enough for the likes of Tony Abbott and plenty of others within the government as well who would like to see a more dramatic cut. Indeed, we've seen some of the states weighing in now as well. The New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian also arguing for a cut in the migration intake, essentially arguing that, well, Sydney is too full, to borrow the words of the former Premier Bob Carr. Now, Scott Morrison is indicating some willingness to move on this, but it's worth getting into some facts when we talk about the migration debate, about where the pressure is coming from. First, let's have a look at net overseas migration. And there's no doubt when you have a look at this chart from the Bureau of Statistics that we have seen quite a rise. This is over the last 40 or 50 years, but in the last 10 years in particular. And yes, that had a lot to do with the mining boom and a big intake of workforce during that time. But since then, the last 10 years, we have seen net overseas migration grow substantially. It now sits at around just over 262,000 a year. But it's worth breaking this down because remember earlier in the year, Scott Morrison, when he was asked about this, pointed out that where the increase in population growth has actually come from is more temporary migration, not the level of permanent immigration. He's right about that. But here's a look at the state breakdown, where they're going. New South Wales, more than 104,000 people. Victoria, more than 90,000 people. Queensland, more than 35,000. Then it drops right down. Much smaller intake in the smaller states. But as I say, and as Scott Morrison said earlier in the year, it's temporary migration that makes up the bulk of this net overseas migration intake. In fact, 58% of that net overseas migration is from temporary visas, and a lot of them higher education, nearly 19%. We're talking about students, foreign students coming to study in Australia. Visitors, so tourists and so on, about 13%. Working holidays, a little over 9%, and so on. Some other visa categories there. These are the temporary visa categories. What about permanent migration? Makes up a lesser proportion of the net overseas migration intake. But as you can see, about 8.5% of the net overseas migration intake are skilled permanent migrants, just over 5% family reunion visas, just over 4% the humanitarian, so the refugee and others, and then some other permanent visas as well. And yes, on top of that, there's some New Zealand movement as well under the Section 444 class visa that they have. So the point there is it's temporary migration, a point Scott Morrison made well earlier in the year, that's driving this increase in the net overseas migration, adding to that population pressure in Sydney and Melbourne. And yet now, Scott Morrison is saying there's a need to cut the permanent migration intake. Here he was last night.
My approach is to actually get away from the top-down discussions about population to set our intake cap and get into a discussion from the bottom up. Now, I believe that this is likely to end up in revising down the permanent migration cap in Australia.
So do we need to actually bring down that cap for permanent migration? Do we need to do something about temporary migration? Is it too many foreign students coming in? Well, that would carry a big cost for the university sector and the Australian economy. It's one of our biggest export sectors. Labor isn't closed to any of this. It's clearly aware of how sensitive the politics are in this. Here was the Deputy Labor leader, Tanya Plibersek, today.
It's a bit rich, 5 minutes before an election, for Scott Morrison to say, oh, everything we've been doing for the last 5 years, I'm going to change that. Some months ago, Labor offered bipartisanship to Scott Morrison when it came to setting levels of migration. We think this is very important to get right for our economy and for our society.
Well, let's go to our guest this afternoon. The Immigration Minister, David Coleman, joins me from Sydney. Minister, thanks very much for your time this afternoon. Do we need to reduce permanent migration or temporary migration?
Look, I want to firstly address Tanya Plibersek's comments, David, which were just absurd. I mean, under Labor, we saw a huge increase in temporary migration through 457s. The system was out of control. We put in place the temporary skill shortage visa, under which there are about half as many people coming. And importantly, the average salary is about $15,000 a year higher. So that has achieved the goal of controlling the rate of migration, but also ensuring that they're more highly skilled individuals. Now, in terms of your broader point about permanent and temporary visas, as the PM's acknowledged last night, the reality is we do have significant population pressures in Sydney and Melbourne. We've got the substantial majority of people going to those places, and we do have the tax on people that is congestion, and that's why the government's so focused on reducing congestion. So these issues do have to be addressed. The PM said last night, he did make his remarks about the permanent program, but he also said that the temporary program is important too, and all these things are interrelated. So you're right to raise the importance of the temporary program, but Labor raising temporary visas is just absurd, given that they were the world champions of 457s.
All right, well, let's just leave Labor to one side. You've been in government 5 years now. Let's look at what you're going to do. Just to be clear on this, do you think there's a need to reduce the permanent migration intake?
Look, I think that we have seen, as I said, significant congestion problems, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. I know in my own electorate in Sydney, congestion is a huge issue, and the fact is that migration does contribute to that. What the PM said last night, David, was that although the permanent ceiling number is 190,000, the actual number for the last financial year is 162,000, and his comments were along the lines of saying that he anticipates that the permanent cap may more closely align with the actual. So yeah, that makes absolute sense. We'll have an orderly process talking to the states and territories and others about their views on where the number should be, because we can't have a situation where the states, who are, of course, responsible for so much infrastructure delivery, aren't, as involved as they could be. And that, historically, that has been the case. So we want to fix that. We're going to fix that through the COAG process that the PM's outlined. And just on that point, Minister, yeah. Sorry to interrupt, just on that point, the states already do make annual submissions on what the immigration number should be. Yeah, they do, but the reality is, David, that consultation process hasn't been as detailed or as specific or, frankly, granular as it should be. It's not about just putting a number out there. You'll have a longer conversation with them, but ultimately you will still make the decision, is that right? That is right. It is a federal responsibility, and we'll make the decision. But as the PM said, he wants to hear from the states about, what's your carrying capacity of people, not just in the cities, but in the regions too. Because we do have this anomaly, David, at the moment, where we've got very high levels of growth and congestion, Sydney, Melbourne, southeast Queensland. And then I've got people in my office pretty much every week, David, from regional Australia saying we want more migration. So at the moment we're looking to do a deal in Warrnambool and a range of other places. And this is what we've heard from the government through much of this year, that you want to try and get people out into the regions and away from Sydney and Melbourne, the big population centres that frankly are very congested right now. So you seem to be shifting the debate though now to actually, no, we're actually going to cut the migration intake. When you say a 30,000 cut in the permanent migration intake would be appropriate, are you talking about the skilled migrants? Are you talking about the family reunions, or are you talking about humanitarian? Yeah, well, look, obviously, David, we're going to work through those issues, and that is something that the government will have more to say about in the future. But I would say a very important point, David, skilled migration has been very positive for Australia, very positive. And it is very important that the ability of the country to bring in skills when needed to add to the economy stays strong, and anything we do in this space will have a very, very sharp focus on skilled migration. If you go back 20 years, admittedly a long time ago, the program used to be family-focused. You're not going to touch skilled migration. You're going to tackle family reunions or humanitarian visas. Well, no, I don't think you should read that in specifically, David. But what I would say is that we will have a very sharp focus on the economic benefits of the program to Australia. At the end of the day, immigration is effectively a recruitment exercise for the country, and we need to be able to say this is positive for the country, it's positive for our economy. I mean, 1 in 3 small businesses in Australia, David,
refugees
is
and
run by a
family
migrant.
reunions positive for our economy?
Well, I mean, look, family reunions are really important, David, and as I say, we'll have more to say in terms of the composition on this program after we complete the consultation process. But skilled migration it's about 70% of the program now, David, so it's not revolutionary for me to say that this is very important. It's the bulk of the program already, and it's really important that we maintain that focus. It's really important that we look at the different elements within the skilled program, because it's not just one skilled program, there's a range of different elements within it. And at the end of the day, we need to be able to say that we have created the program which is in the best interest of Australia. It's our program. It must reflect our choices. One of our choices under this government has been to have a strong economic focus. That has been very successful, and we'll continue to have a strong economic focus.
But coming back to Scott Morrison's own words just this year, a permanent cut to the permanent intake, it's very hard to look at the data and see that that's actually the problem. Do you agree with Scott Morrison on that it's temporary migration that's the problem?
Well, I think that both need to be considered, as I said, David. But as you pointed out in your intro, within the temporary program, the biggest category is students. Now, really important to understand how significant students are to our economy. Third largest export industry, $31 billion a year to Australia. Put that in perspective. Beef exports per year, $7 billion. Education, $31. So this is a really big deal, the Australian education sector, and the income that they generate is very substantial. They generate a 6-figure number of jobs, which tend to be high-wage, high-skilled jobs, good for the economy. And so to sort of... it's right to focus on temporary, but you've also got to say, well, what is the issues, what are the specific issues within temporary? And education, which is the biggest category within temporary, is a very good thing for the country.
So you're not going to touch that. It is, as you point out there very well, it's a hugely important market for Australia. Can I just clarify, you're not going to cut the number of foreign students coming to Australia? Well,
again, David, I mean, full points for the question, but I'm not here to announce the outcome of the process today. We'll work through that in an orderly way, but I'm very happy to send an unambiguous message that the international education sector is extremely positive for the Australian economy. It has had a very strong track record in this nation. It's our third largest export industry, and it underpins high-wage, high-skilled jobs. Very important. So all of these factors will be taken into account.
I think we get your message. OK, no, fair enough. But can I just ask you on the process? I mean, Tanya Plibersek said it's 5 minutes to the election. She's kind of got a point, right? You've been in office 5 years. An election is just around the corner. When are we going to see some detail on this?
Yeah, well, Tanya Plibersek, as is often the case, David, is wrong on that. Every year there's an annual program around the migration number and a consultation process. It's typically announced around the time of the budget in the second half of the financial year. What we're saying this year is that we're also adding this important layer on this broader population question. And, you know, Alan Tudge is doing great work in looking at this broader population question, the infrastructure, the internal migration, a range of other important issues. So the annual discussion about the migration program happens every year. The results of that are released towards the end of the financial year. This year is the same in terms of timing, but what's different this year is the PM saying, let's have this broader discussion about population, because we've got to take the pressure off in Sydney, Melbourne, South East Queensland, where it's been felt so substantially, and we should, frankly, involve the states far more than they have been in the past. But the actual timing is entirely consistent with previous years.